Hello and welcome to the Time of Telling. I'm Mark Walker, and this podcast is based on my unpublished manuscript, The Time of Telling, John Star Cook and the Word of One Tarot. So we're going to jump right back in to where we left off in the previous episode. So it's 1966, John Cook is in Mexico, and the Ouija sessions are in their final stages. Soon after a New Year's Day session, John and Given flew up to San Francisco and stayed at Alice's. Now we're just going to go into the background of Alice and Roger for a moment or two, just to set the scene of where it was that John was staying at his sister's house. So Alice Cook and Roger Kent were engaged in 1929. Roger was the son of William and Elizabeth Kent. William Kent served in Congress between 1910 and 1917. Roger graduated from Yale College in 1928 and then attended Yale Law School. Alice herself attended Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And Roger had made a trip over to the Hawaiian Islands where he'd met Alice, and things went from there. Roger's father, William, who had died in 1928 of pneumonia aged 64, was a champion for environmental preservation, as was his wife Elizabeth, a suffragist, militant protester and arrestee. William agreed with the idea of protest, but disagreed on tactics. Together, they purchased 611 acres of redwood forest, preserving it. It was named Muir Woods in 1908 and was made a national monument. Alice and Roger were married in, quote, a quiet affair with only relatives present at the Cook home in Honolulu on the 26th of August 1930. 8 members of the Kent family came from the mainland, including best man Roger's brother Sherman. The LA Times reported on August the 16th, liner delayed for bridesmaid. Rather than have the wedding postponed, the Matson line held the Malolo in port for several hours, waiting for Miss Catherine Carpenter, delayed by storms in Wyoming. So Roger continued at Yale Law School until he graduated in 1931, whereupon he and Alice moved to Kentfield in Marin County, California, where he practiced law. Their home at 200 Woodland Road had been built in 1874 by Roger's grandfather, Albert E. Kent, an early settler in Marin County. So, that is the house where Roger and Alice lived, and John and Given had just flown up to San Francisco to stay. This may have been the first time that John had returned to the US since moving to Mexico 18 months earlier. Alice later said that John came up to the US for a total of 3 operations on the shoulder wound, and this may have been when the first operation happened. Mitch, by this stage, had returned to San Francisco from the East Coast and was invited to join them all for dinner, either at Kentfield or Bolinas. John brought the after-dinner discussion around to Meher Baba and suggested to Mitch that he should get in touch with Ivy Douche and arrange to meet Baba. Ivy Douche ran the Sufism Reoriented Centre near the Avalon Ballroom in the Haight-Ashbury district. There would soon occur a meeting in the Haight-Ashbury with Richard Alpert presiding to read out a letter from Meher Baba to discuss the way forward with LSD. Baba's position was that LSD could open the door, but you still had to go through the door. The drugs were not going to take you to a new life. Anyway, there was no need for Mitch to make arrangements to meet Baba. When he went to bed, drug-free, he received a visitation. As he lay there, a silver, bullet-shaped, hermetically sealed spaceship appeared. It opened, he got in, and it zoomed up to high heaven. Mitch says he didn't see Baba, but heard the mute voice of the silent Sufi. Give up your worries, I will take care of everything. Become my disciple. But it wasn't going to happen. John's enthusiasm for Baba did not rub off on Mitch despite the Star Trek luster. Sweet Timothy / Martin, on the other hand, had become an ardent follower and was attending meetings in San Francisco. Martin was staying at Bolinas in a property owned by Alice and Roger. This gated enclave was downtown and right on the lagoon. Mitch ended up staying here too, until his friends Bob and Connie went to India in early '66 and allowed him to have their studio in the Haight-Ashbury at Haight and Clayton. 2 Ouija sessions were held in Bolinas in mid-January. The first was with Legion, John, Given, Sweet Timothy and Lorna, which was Alice. And the second with Gayla, or Rosalind, in Alice's place. Rosalind was living in the guest cottage at Carmel, which I take it was being rented out by John. These 2 sessions gave further doctrinal information on one consciousness as well as insights into the emotional well-being of some of the participants. Mitch went down to visit Rosalind in Stinson Beach, where they both took morning glory seeds. The experience brought them closer together, and they subsequently moved in together at the place Mitch had been bequeathed from Bob and Connie in the Haight-Ashbury, known as the Palace on the Panhandle. The palace was a 6-room Victorian, with only Mitch and Rosalind living there. John and Given arrived back in Cuernavaca on the 31st of January, after stopping in at Arthur Munro's house in Ojibik. On the 1st of February '66, he wrote to Michael, Dear Michael, I'm doing my best. I find I cannot send film, so am concealing it in book. Here are some of S.T. Martin's hallucinations. I personally like the ink koans, but I don't know if they will be of any use to you. As you know, S.T. sketches usually in colour, but there may be a usable 1 or 2 in the 5 I am enclosing. Also included is one by Lem, which symbolically is interesting since he is not an artist. Thank you for the letter which was here on my arrival yesterday. Glad Pat, which is Pat Cassidy, is on the way to India. Saw Kate N at Arthur's on the way back. She was still complaining about a certain $200 and looked like hell with a concussed head group. Holly in her own dream trip, which now includes a beautiful, silent Negro. All power to Benny. Please return enclosed. Love, 7L, or John. Now, what could it have been that was concealed in the book? Was it LSD? Sending LSD to somebody in contact with Timothy Leary seems a little like sending ice to the Arctic, but you never know. A couple of weeks later, John reports to Alice that he has given the last of his LSD to Letty, his housemaid. Not that that means anything. So the Ouija sessions drew to a close on the 10th of February 1966, when the final session, number 105, took place. John asked, "What now?" And we responds, "Now is the period when the found box is unlidded. A clear gaze is required, a stout heart also. The contents issue forth powerfully. That which is before the issue and unlike the issue will not survive. John asks, what is the issue? We responds, that which has awaited the unlidding. Your box is not like another box. You are its contents. John says, please say more about this. We responds, listen well to this. A certain man went to the place of hiding for treasure. Disappointed at finding a bare box, he discarded it and searched forevermore for his treasure. You have travelled to the hiding place and released the box from its niche and opened it. In it you have found that which is like a mirror. One steady look within has told you of you. Then, the box has no importance as you issue forth. If you look in the mirror and do not know you, then you are as the certain man forevermore searching his treasure. So, that was the end of the Ouija sessions. The treasure hunt was at an end. What had begun as a casual experiment with a homemade Ouija board 3.5 years earlier had grown into a substantial doctrine expressed in the images of the 22 books of tea, or Word of One tarot. It would be a further 3.5 years before the new tarot for the Aquarian Age, or the Word of One tarot, would be issued as a tarot deck. So there was then an exodus to the north from Cuernavaca, from John's home. Given left for Bolinas, where he was soon joined by Thomas. So John had, from time to time, quit drinking. Over a decade earlier in Africa, John had been told to never drink again. By the 11th of March, he had stopped drinking, reasoning that alcohol submerges the G-force and hence raises havoc with anybody who carries it. The G in me is fearless, but I have been afraid of it, and it could only manifest when I knocked myself out by alcohol and let loose the whole wild gamut of the unconscious. This, to me, is what must be reversed. The force of the unconscious made conscious. And I know I am over the hump, but it has been a long, crazy search from Angola to Jutepec. John continues to Alice. All of these strange actions down here evidently had to take place in order to open what the notes termed the tomb of the dead king. Well, the lid must be off that old box by now. So with John's drinking, he managed to stay on the wagon for about a year, except for Thanksgiving. On the 14th of March, John reported a dream to Alice, where a group of us, himself, Alice, Rosalind, Given, Martin Green, Sweet Timothy, where a group of us has to put on a play to which none of them know the lines. John races down to the basement to find his lines, but there is no script, so he goes back upstairs. The play has begun. Given is the young lead, but he is drunk and giggling. Alice is performing well, and John joins her, but the set is wrong. It is a tree, and they are in its branches instead of on the stage. John guides them all to the proper stage, but then there is a sudden explosion on stage from a jealous rival theatre group, and fire rages with no escape. John felt very strongly that there was great action afoot, and that he was somehow personally involved. He wrote to Alice on the 15th of March, "I sense that something happens first, something good, not bad, something here in Mexico. The electricity to be turned on in the basement, the royal maze to be outed, the elevators to work, something. The heart of the action lies here. I must await that action, or produce it, or something. Something very ancient is to come to light again, to be unearthed. I sense this as strongly as I once sensed it in Africa before I went to sleep. G is the jewel in the lion's mouth, his own tail. G is not to be swallowed, but to be released." And that is John commenting on some of the doctrine from the Word of One. John considered the outing of the royal maze to be a factor in the societal transformation he saw as necessary and inevitable, and in which he was to be somehow involved. The 22 images of the Word of One tarot needed to be seen by more than those just in John's circle. These 22 new tarot trumps presented the reversal of each regular tarot trump to a more accurate archetype. John and Michael considered that this reversal, which involved the transcendence of the individual ego, was necessary for mankind to survive into the future. On the 16th of March, John wrote to Alice, "In the land of the West, the great event is being prepared." So this shows that John was expecting something to take place, an event which would allow the new reversed archetypes to come into the world. The concept had been intimated in some of the Ouija sessions, the notion that there was some kind of happening that needed to occur in order for mankind to progress beyond its current troubled state and to fulfill its potential. There was a problem with the human thinking process due to the sense of separation, of ego identity, resulting in a dualistic world with its wars. Some kind of spectacular demonstration of unity, the great event, was necessary to kickstart the process of reversing away from this sense of separateness and towards sanity on a grand scale. This was something he was also discussing with Michael Bowen. But John still had various mundane concerns. He was having trouble with the so-called secret police, demanding money from his guests and at my heel for narcotics. These secret police were in a kind of political war with the real police of Cuernavaca, and for a time, John considered fleeing to the US. There was also love. John revealed to Alice on the 6th of April that he was going to get married. John loved Ingrid. He realized that the main reason he had been in Cuernavaca was to meet her and for their destinies to entwine. He wrote, "Ingrid is so wonderful to be with, so different from those other two exes." John reported that there was dynamite between them, but that he had sexual challenges to overcome. "I can make another ecstatic in bed, especially a woman, and for myself, nada. A frigid virgin. It terrifies me going into a marriage with such a state of affairs. And I know what love is. The heart is overwhelming. To compensate, my dreams are full of misfiring skyrockets, explosions, and fire hoses that go wild with nobody hanging on to them. This sex business must be resolved." John had bought Ingrid a very beautiful Elizabethan emerald, a ruby, a very beautiful Elizabethan emerald, ruby, and diamond ring, which I wheedled Akim into selling me, or is it Renaissance? And their engagement was announced in the local papers. Hilariously, the announcement referred to John as the great-grandson of Captain Cook. It said, "The engagement of the great-grandson of Captain Cook, John Cook, has been announced today to Mrs. Jan Smith of Honolulu." But it was all over before it began. Considering Alice's dim view of John's first wife, Millen, and her equally dim view of John's second wife, Mary, Alice probably had concerns for a potential third wife. In any case, John told Alice on the 11th of April that he had changed his mind about our marriage to Ingrid before it was too late. John said he had tried pretense in marriage previously and the result was drastic. So the psychedelic revolution continued apace. Life magazines screamed LSD, the exploding threat of the mind drug that got out of control. Things were certainly happening. Owsley acquired a pill press. He put out a batch of about 4,000 pills, which he dyed with a blue tint and named Blue Cheer. Bear later explained that he did not set out to be a major supplier of the stuff. He was interested in it and wanted to make the purest stuff possible for his own enjoyment, but it was only possible to make in batches consisting of thousands of doses. Psychedelic Prayers by Timothy Leary was published with cover art by Michael Bowen. The cover was chosen by Harry Smith, who Leary brought over to Bowen's studio for that purpose. Bowen recalls a twisted, dirty finger with a twisted, dirty fingernail pointing. That's the one. Leary's world was full of trouble. His marijuana bust on the way to Mexico now resulted in the state of Texas hitting him with a 30-year prison sentence and a $30,000 fine. Of course, he appealed. Around this time, Leary and Michael discussed and formulated a new approach to the legal issues resulting from the use of psychedelics. The idea was to set up a group of 7, 6 LSD enthusiasts and 1 lawyer, and, hey presto, you have your own religion. The idea would be launched by Leary some months later as the League for Spiritual Discovery. As Leary said, the model that we worked out, which our lawyers tell us looks pretty good, is that the tribe gets together and puts down on paper its tribal code, its tribal rituals, its sacraments, its rituals, its center, and it states very clearly that it is going to worship in this way, in this place. Michael Bowen had re-established contact with Big Bill Fortner, who was no longer flippy in Santa Barbara, as John had put it, but was in the Lower East Side of New York at Bowen's studio. "Yeah, man, I bumped into the Queen of England, just like Fausto told me I would." Big Bill had either reconsidered his remarks about the experience with Fausto being a really bad kind of insanity, or had decided to join the insanity. Big Bill pledged to his old friend Michael that he would be his servant and protector, just like Fausto had said. And so Michael and Big Bill set off for Millbrook together on Saturday the 16th of April 66. It was Michael's 5th and final visit. Whereas Michael and Big Bill's previous experience of taking Toloache in the Hutepec Garden with Fausto at John's reminded Michael of the attack of the body snatchers, this time the tone of their shared drug experience was that of a B-grade Frankenstein movie. There was an evil scientist in a 64-room mansion with a nearby village of frightened country folk who were determined to put a stop to whatever was going on over there. According to Bowen, there were 22 people present at Millbrook, and as the day stretched into evening, an enormous fire was built near the woods behind the big house. Some people sat around watching the fire, some people were inside watching films. The fire burned for many hours. There were endless rounds of row, row, row your boat, and roasted marshmallows, and peace, joy, beauty, and love. But they were being watched by the police of Dutchess County, hidden in the shadows of the woods. Michael and Big Bill were the last to leave the 6-foot diameter of glowing coals. Without saying a word, they each picked up handfuls of dirt and began to cover parts of the glowing coals. Gradually, a perfect 8-pointed star appeared, glowing and pulsating into the black space of the night. Michael then watched films for a while. Tulips in time-lapse, endlessly going through their life cycle, and then went to bed. The police were also, from a safe distance, watching those nature films and films of endless waterfalls. Suddenly, at 2 a.m, the script changed from a B-grade Frankenstein film to a B-grade Nazi film, as Michael and Great Dane Tora, asleep in the turret room, were awakened by a great commotion at the front door down below. G. Gordon Liddy, Assistant Attorney General for Dutchess County, was in charge of what would become known as the Great Millbrook Bust. Of course, later, Liddy would achieve notoriety as one of the key figures in the Watergate scandal. So Michael had bags of marijuana that needed to be disposed of. So he made a hole in the window mesh of the first floor room and pushed it out, where it happened to rain down upon the numerous police officers coming in through the kitchen entrance below. Later, in the downstairs meditation room, while the police processed everyone, Michael noticed the surreal scene of bits of marijuana stuck to the felt hats of the arresting officers. Back in New York City, Michael phoned John at his neighbour's house and told him about the bust at the Castalia Foundation. John was interested to hear that there were 22 people present, the same number as the books of tea, which had been Michael's entree into the Castalia Foundation. John and Michael had spoken earlier about the great event that John felt destined to foster and whereabouts this great event might occur. It had now become apparent that the East Coast was not where it was at. A few months earlier, news of the Trips Festival in San Francisco made Michael consider that the great event might take place in San Francisco. The Great Millbrook Bust had made up Michael's mind that Millbrook was certainly not the place and that it was time to move on to San Francisco. And so now a plan was formulated. The first part of the mission had been achieved. John had sent Michael to find Timothy Leary, to assess him and to draw him into the fold of the doctrine of one consciousness. Michael's assessment of Leary, which he revealed to John, was that he, Leary, made him more paranoid than anyone he had ever met. Now it was time for the next step. Having made the link with Leary and his people, it was time to leave them to their own devices. By this stage, Michael's idea for a new religion with LSD as its sacrament, the League for Spiritual Discovery, was in Leary's consciousness, and the seed of one consciousness had been planted. As John had said previously, just go and follow your instincts. John sent some money to Michael to help with the move back to San Francisco. First, Michael turned over the apartment on the Lower East Side to Paul Krasner of The Realist. Bowen's studio apartment was on Avenue A, near Tompkins Square Park. He packed up his stuff, put it on a freight train, and within 2 weeks of the Millbrook bust, he had flown into San Francisco with Big Bill. So, on the 8th of May 1966, John received 2 visitors, Marianne and Axel Joachim Jensen. Now, to explain who these people are, we need to go back to the 1950s. So, here we go. Axel Jensen of Norway was a young, mystically inclined writer who is determined to leave civilization behind. He decided he would live in the Sahara Desert. In 1953, together with his friend Pierre Sjoldberg and Pierre's girlfriend Elise Berit, he set off for Africa. Elise got as far as Nice and remained there, but Axel and Pierre hitchhiked on, riding into smugglers' vehicles into Tamanrasset, stronghold of the Tuareg Sufis. Pierre departed after a couple of months. Axel remained. He lived alone in the Sahara, near Tamanrasset, in a shelter made of stones. Axel was on a quest of self-knowledge, comparable to that of the saints. At a stone desk, he worked on a narrative of his experience. Quoting from Marianne's memoir, Axel gave himself over to solitude and his own reflections. Surrounded by thousands of miles of sand, he had fixed himself up with a stone shelter and begun on a novel about his great passage through the desert. He wrote about craving insights other than those applied by the established elite. He wrote about the fabulous and the supernatural. At midnight, on the 31st of December, John Starr Cook turned up in Axel's world. Going back to Marianne's memoir, when Axel was deep in the Sahara, the bizarre man had appeared, riding a white camel. Cook was dressed in a black burnous and didn't have a hair on his head. He told Axel that he was an incarnation of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, and that he had met both Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. Everything that Axel had been so absorbed by had materialized before his eyes when he encountered Cook in the desert. So, it was actually John who says that they met at midnight on the 31st of December. According to Axel Jensen's biographer, Torgrim Eggen, Axel's diary gives the date of their meeting as the 20th of January 1954 in Tamanrasset, and that they went out into the desert 2 days later. So there we have John's not letting the truth get in the way of a good story. John says that he and Axel brought snow to the edge of the Sahara by chanting Vitbjorn, white bear, and that it was a time when the seeming coincidences were incredible. Going back to Marianne's biography, one evening, John had the idea that he and Axel should swing a pendant over a map and travel together to wherever the pendant stopped. The pendant came to a standstill over the town of Oxfjord in Finnmark, Norway's northernmost county. It was simply a matter of leaving the Sahara and pointing their noses northward. By the 1st of April, Axel and John were in Karasjok, Norway. For about a month, they travelled together and collaborated on the Ringmaster's Cross. John drew an illustration for the cover drawing on his knowledge of the tarot. It was the Hierophant card with Axel's axe. The book came out about a year later, Diotemerens Course, in 1955, but Axel had some kind of a freak out and burned the entire print run. Axel taught John how to ski. Axel's biographer, Torgrim Eggen, says that Axel was an excellent skier and had met with great frustration trying to pass on the art to the Hawaiian. John reports that he was chased by wolves skiing in Norway, but Eggen suggests that if this were the case, John would have been caught by the wolves. By May, John and Axel were on a boat to Tromsø, presumably from Oxfjord, and Axel's big adventure would soon be over. By August 1954, he was back in Oslo. Axel had attracted some attention at a party in Oslo. His time in the desert had given him a deep suntan, and as he talked of the Sahara and of the mysteries and of John Star Cook, a young girl was entranced and knew that her life was about to take a new direction. Her name was Marianne Elin. Axel was brown and sexy, and the first thing he spoke to her about was theta, mest, M-E-S-T. This is some kind of Scientology theory that Ron came up with in 1950. Evidently, John knew about it and discussed it with Axel. Marianne described Axel as intense and loquacious, learned and intellectual. And when John was struck down with paralysis and went off to Copenhagen, when Guyson sent him off to Copenhagen from France, Axel had met John at Copenhagen airport and helped to arrange for his admission to Blegdam Hospital in Copenhagen. Soon after his admittance, Axel introduced John to Marianne. Marianne stared at John. She had heard so much of this amazing man from her boyfriend Axel, and here he was, paralyzed by polio. She looked upon him pityingly and said that she felt sorry for him. "Cut that out," John had replied sharply. "It's no help." John instead directed Marianne to a young woman in the next room who had been involved in an automobile accident not long after being married and was trying to write down her thoughts with a pencil gripped between her teeth. John wrote to Alice on the 27th of April 1957 from Blegdam. "This past week, Axel has been here with Marianne, his darling blonde girl. Oh, what sweet people these two are." When Marianne left Copenhagen to go back to Oslo, John gave her a half-kilo gold bar. He told her to sell it and to put the money in the bank. John spent several months at Blegdam, but there was no improvement. It was time to move on. John decided that a visit to Mayher Mount in the US would be the next move, and he made plans with Axel. So, John was back on US soil on the 15th of July 1957 at Mayher Mount with Axel. Meher Baba was long gone and was now back home in Meherazad, India. Axel had accompanied John from Blegdam Hospital in Copenhagen and saw John admitted to a rehabilitation centre in San Francisco. It has been suggested that Axel and John made the acquaintance of Henry Miller at Big Sur at this time, but there is currently no firm evidence to support this. After a time, Axel went back to Norway. His debut novel, Ikaros, the story of a young man's journey across the Sahara, was not only well received critically, it was selling well. As a result, Axel and Marianne could afford to make plans to travel to a place cheap enough to live so that Axel could continue writing. They were going to Greece. Norway's beat writer Axel Jensen. In mid-November, Axel and Marianne left Oslo, travelling south on the road to Athens, aiming to find a place to live the life of a writer. Axel and Marianne arrived in Athens in mid-December and stayed until New Year with their friends Pierre and Elise. When it came time to look for a house of their own to rent, their hosts said that rents were very low on the island of Idra and that it would be an interesting place to live. It sounded ideal for Axel, who had a new book in mind and wished to settle down. By mid-January, they were on Idra and getting to know the small expat community, which included several writers. John wrote to Axel on the 16th of September to say that he had become a damn good astrologer and to ask Axel for his birth details and Marianne's so he could draw up their horoscopes. Axel had let John know that he had broken up with Marianne. John told Axel that he thought it was bad news, that good Marianne was out of his life, that he was in safe waters with her. John felt uncertain how things would be for Axel, and he said that he would study their horoscopes to try to determine how things would go. However, Axel and Marianne managed to reconcile, and they were married on the 22nd of October 1958, and happily married for a time. Axel and Marianne made plans to visit John in July 59, but didn't make it. They were going to have a baby. Axel had completed his novel, Line, and there was finally some money. So, in October, they went to Stockholm with Pierre and Elise to buy a car. It was a Karmann Ghia with a Porsche engine. Axel had lost his license for drink driving, so Marianne drove to Oslo. Line was released, and Axel became a star. So Axel and Marianne had been on Idra for about a year. They had spent Axel's advance for his next novel on a house on the island, and Axel had been writing steadily. He was as intense in his writing technique as he was in regular life. With the money running low, he returned from time to Oslo to seek further advances from his publisher. John wrote to him, "I've seen your idol Henry Miller several times of late. He is a much sweeter gent than one would guess from his stinking writing. I will be in Mexico for 3 months. After a brief period in Peru to unearth certain things, I will try to stop in Norway en route to Egypt to see your magnificent child and beat the shit out of you. Your baby will undoubtedly be a genius. I will not beat him up, nor Mariana, only you. That I love you goes without saying. Mariana too. Baby in womb also." Marianne and Axel had a son, Axel Joachim, in January 1960 in Oslo. Axel had been present at the birth, but soon returned to Idra, and by the time Marianne and the baby followed 4 months later, Axel had a new lover. Axel tried to continue the family unit with the addition of this new twist. It wasn't working, but they stumbled on. Canadian poet Leonard Cohen had arrived on Idra from London on the 13th of April in search of better weather. Cohen recalled seeing Axel and Marianne as a happy couple walking down the beach, but this is far from correct. Marianne met Leonard one day in late May when she left Axel Joachim with a neighbour and went out shopping. Leonard saw her and invited her to join with his friends. Marianne had only known Leonard for a few days, when she asserted herself in her marriage to Axel, confronting him about Patricia, the other woman that he was seeing. Axel flew into a rage and soon had left on his boat, ostensibly heading for Norway. He was going to decide between Marianne and Patricia. Marianne soon had her answer because she wrote Axel a letter, a love letter filled with flower petals. A friend of hers had seen Marianne seal the envelope and had also seen Axel unseal it in Athens at the Posta Restante, with Patricia by his side as the petals fell to the ground. The friend reported this to Marianne, and she knew it was over. Gradually, as summer came along, Marianne and Leonard became closer. Axel continued on his merry way. He accompanied Patricia back to her native Chicago, then wound up in Cuernavaca with John in July. Together, they toured around the place for a couple of weeks and took some sacred mushrooms together. This is the first documented time that John took psychedelics. Another recent visitor at John's had been Andrea Puharich, author of the recently published The Sacred Mushroom, 1959. This may have been the first time that John and Andrea met, although Puharich had a place in Carmel, which was known to Nadine, who might already have introduced them. At any rate, John stayed in touch with Puharich in the years to come, indeed up to the end. Sacred or magic mushrooms had first come to wider public attention in June 1957 when Life magazine published a feature by G. Gordon Wasson on his experience in obtaining and consuming the sacred mushrooms of Mexico 2 years earlier. Axel later wrote to Marianne of this time, "One day we ate a mushroom, chewed it pensively like a cow, and left the rest to chemistry. I discovered that I had testicles in my armpits. The word Oblomov became Vomolbo, and then Vofmoblov became Fofobomfov, etc. This kept us going for hours. Suddenly, I became Buddha. Oh, mushrooms! 24 hours it lasted. I slept and sang arias." By August, Axel was back on Idre, renting a place to continue writing. He was on friendly terms with both Leonard and Marianne. John wrote to Marianne saying that Axel had been a chaotic mess when he arrived, but that he was transformed by the time that he'd left. John wished that Marianne could be in Cuernavaca to talk about all of the recent goings-on. John wrote, "It must be god-awful to be married to a man who is a genius in unhooking other people's psyches, god-awful and wonderful at the same time. I imagine you've learned to be very calm and wise. Are you? Or are you putting on masks? If you are, let me give you some advice. No masks. I should know. I donned hundreds of them and they don't work." Marianne had sent John a poem. He had no idea that she wrote. He wishes the light of the Aegean Sea to dwell in her and hopes that Axel will return to her. He asks Marianne for her birth details, which was never supplied by Axel, so he could draw up her horoscope. But Marianne and Leonard were now lovers. Marianne had finally given up on Axel. Leonard wrote a letter to Marianne from Tel Aviv on the 13th of September and bought a house on Idre 2 weeks later. The two lovers lived apart, but came together frequently over the course of an idyllic autumn on Idre. Marianne continued to live at the Eagle's Nest, the Eagle's Nest that Axel had bought a couple of years earlier. She had sent Axel Joachim in August back to the safe hands of her mother in Oslo. The time she had spent living with Axel was like walking on eggshells, just waiting for his next outburst of anger. Marianne could now relax. Marianne and Leonard led an idyllic existence on Idre for a time, but there was the car. Marianne made a plan with Leonard. She had to return the Carmen gear to Norway, otherwise she would be liable for steep import duties. Axel had no license. Leonard's funds were running low and he had to return to Montreal to earn more. Could he drive her to Oslo and return to Montreal from there? They set off for Oslo in November and their romance continued with the trip across Europe. They stayed in Paris, took their time, drove the back roads and stayed at country inns until they arrived in Oslo. After a few days, Leonard went to Montreal. And Leonard later decided to go to Cuba to get a poet's eye view of how the revolution was panning out. He happened to be there on the 17th of April 1961, which was right in the middle of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and was almost jailed on suspicion of being an American spy. But by September, he had found a place to live, apartment rooms in the converted stables of a grand old house in Montreal, in which a friend of his lived. In autumn 1961, he sent a telegram to Marianne in Oslo. "Have house. All I need is my woman and her son. Love, Leonard." Marianne couldn't get there soon enough. And that brings us back to May 1966, when Marianne and Axel came to visit John in Mexico. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you very much for watching. This is The Time of Telling.